Hi everybody. I would like to welcome you all to the SST Lunch Series. And today we're going to hear from Raphael Marcus, who is a visiting researcher at King's College. It's also where he received his PhD. And he is currently affiliated with the college's Insurgency Research Group. Today we're lucky he's here to discuss his new book, Israel's Long War with Hezbollah, Military Innovation and Adaptation Under Fire. This book is the first complete military history of the decades-long Israel-Hezbollah conflict and an analysis of military innovation and adaptation. As an expert on organizational learning, Raphael analyzes ongoing processes of strategic and operational innovation and adaptation by both the IDF and Hezbollah throughout the long guerrilla war. The conclusions illuminate the dynamics of the ongoing conflict and illustrate the complexity of military adaptation under fire. Raphael, thank you so much for joining us today and coming to talk to us about your book. There's a display copy of the book and some flyers out on the table in front. So I'd like to welcome you to SST.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming, for braving the rain. I'm sure I'm not the only one with wet shoes right now. Thanks to the professor for the introduction, and thank you so much to Georgetown University Press for nurturing this little baby from doctoral thesis through to the publication process. They did great work and helped tremendously. So I'll talk for about 40 minutes, sort of explain to you why this topic is important. The book, Israel's Long War with Hezbollah, is the first complete military analysis, military history of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict in English, and looks at sort of the big milestones of organizational change between Israel and Hezbollah from the 1980s, when the conflict originates, to up into the present day. So speaking of the present day, just want to see where are we right now between Israel and Hezbollah. If you look at Syria, you have Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese Shiite militant group, fighting alongside Bashar al-Assad, along with the Iranians, in Syria, against Sunni rebels, not so moderate rebels, ISIS, and the whole collection of militias. You have the Israeli army carrying out intermittent airstrikes against Lebanese targets, Syrian targets, Iranian targets. How on earth did we get to this point where it doesn't even seem like Lebanon is the is sort of the focal point of the conflict anymore? So I'll sort of work it backwards and highlight some of the key milestones from the origins of the conflict to today that animate our understanding of what's going on. In truth, what got me started looking at all this was the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. Big flash. And for the first time, I think Hezbollah, since the 1980s, was on the world stage. Israel and Hezbollah fought a 34-day war. And Hezbollah actually, fought the narrative developed that Hezbollah fought the famous technologically superior Israeli army to a standstill. And everyone in the defense community here in the UK and everywhere in between was like, how on earth did that just happen? The Israeli army, fabled for its technological innovation, its sort of, rich and dynamic military history, essentially, and it's much more nuanced than that, but fought a tie with Hezbollah, which everybody had always thought, terrorist group, guerrilla. How did it get to the point where it had fired 3,000 to 4,000 rockets, long-range rockets, short-range rockets, looking more and more like a conventional military than, in fact, a guerrilla or terrorist group? And the defense community in the U.S., I don't know if anybody browses U.S. Army handbooks for fun or U.S. Army doctrinal publications. The U.S. Army capstone a few years after the 2006 war called the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war as the harbinger of future conflict. That this is Hezbollah will represent the archetypal type of future adversary that we expect to see in future operations. And everybody dove right in. The Pentagon did millions of analyses of how did Hezbollah get to where it is, what went wrong with the Israeli army. The British Ministry of Defense, in their future character of conflict assessment, were like, the 2006 war is the epitome of what we expect to face, with militants embedded amongst the civilian population, all the operational challenges which we know that the United States and the UK and everybody faces in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And of course, the construct hybrid warfare also emerged out of this, from this war. The one who sort of put that forward was Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hoffman, who actually endorsed the book. So I thought it was nice that I could. And he argued that Hezbollah essentially fought a hybrid of conventional military tactics, unconventional, asymmetrical, terrorist, criminal, the whole from this whole spectrum of conflict. But what I think many of the assessments failed to look at was how the past animated what happened in 2006. Everybody sort of explained what went wrong, but no one really looked at why. And people forget that there were essentially 2 decades of counter-guerrilla, asymmetrical, low-intensity conflict, choose your jargon of choice, before 2006. And people really didn't adequately look at the lessons learned and the large-scale organizational processes that both Israel and Hezbollah sort of picked up and learned from along the way. It's not that people neglected the past, but they didn't really, I think, adequately delve into looking at the lesson learning processes on both sides. Gotta get a caffeine hit. So what the book does is essentially look at the conflict from its origins in 1982, which is when the Israeli army enters Lebanon, and highlights the major milestones along the way. In certain points of the book, it actually looks at specific processes of organizational learning. And for this talk, I'll keep it more like a broader view. Though in the Q&A, I'm happy to dive into some of the process about how the Israeli army grappled with incorporating certain military concepts, the influence of the U.S. Army Doctrine, and how the IDF did what it did in Lebanon. And I also looked at how Hezbollah evolved from its humble origins as a ragtag guerrilla militia, part of the Lebanese civil war, to get to this point where it's got more technology and better trained and fight better than most conventional Arab militaries. So I'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then always looking forward to some questions. And just to highlight sort of the importance of the past, I won't go into methodology because everybody hates that, but I did lots of interviews with Israeli generals, UN peacekeepers, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, British diplomats, soldiers who were on the ground throughout the 80s, 90s, key decision makers, and did some field work in Lebanon, interviewed a Hezbollah official. But the meat of the Hezbollah research was diving into some of the leaders' statements and interviews from Hezbollah Secretary Generals from the 80s, 90s to today. And it's an amazing organizational repository for information. They really have, Hezbollah's leadership has a very dynamic and calculated understanding of conflict. They're also amazingly vocal at times about how they assess the conflict is going from the very beginning. So there was a quote from Nasrallah just for how important the past is for animating Hezbollah's current and future learning. He goes, we adhere to the past, it's part of our history, and if we don't learn from the past, we don't learn from our historical mistakes, we're going to make even more mistakes. And just when I was poring over the data and what all these Hezbollah officials had said over the years, they scrutinized the Israeli army incredibly closely at every point of the conflict, from the 80s to today. The post-2006 war military commission that Israel launched, called the Winograd Commission, was basically a panel of experts, military, legal, political, to look at what went wrong. And there's just amazing interviews with Hezbollah. Like, the Winograd Commission is the most important thing that's ever happened. He's like, I applaud the Israelis who realized how much they screwed up, and we're learning from them. We have to, we'll look at the Winograd report with respect, because when our enemies look at their mistakes, so it's just sort of this amazing lesson learning process, like in any conflict. The book opens with a quote from Clausewitz about, the reciprocal reaction, a duel between adversaries in a wrestling match. And I just think it's an amazing conflict for sort of exemplifying that tug. So how does it all start? Lebanon is convulsed in civil war from 1975 onwards, and the PLO had found themselves in Lebanon after being kicked out from Jordan in 1970 in Black September. Hezbollah doesn't exist. Lebanon, a multi-sectarian confessional society, Christians, Maronites, Sunnis, Shia, and everybody in between. The whole society convulses, everybody's fighting each other. And within this context, there's increasing Palestinian militant incursions into northern Israel, some very high-profile, well-known attacks. And Ariel Sharon, who's a defense minister, and Menachem Begin, the prime minister, basically come to the idea that they're going to invade Lebanon, and when they enter into Lebanon, they're sort of quite easily mop up the PLO, and Yasser Arafat and the rest of the PLO get on their boats and end up in Tunis. They're like, everything's going great. And what they wanted to do was get the PLO out of Lebanon, stop the attacks, ideally install a Maronite friendly to Israel government under Bashir Gemayel, which is, I don't know if anyone saw the movie Waltz with Bashir. It sort of highlights this whole period. And the Shiites don't even really factor into the equation. Now, with the Israelis, and I won't delve into this too much, but the people like to say that Hezbollah emerged because of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. While this is sort of true, it sort of neglects a lot of the historical, religious, and sociological currents going on in Shiite society in the years leading up to the Israelis rolling in. The Shiites in Lebanon just quickly historically marginalized by the central government, long-standing, festering resentment of the central government, disenfranchised, operating sort of, at the time, a passive approach is how it's always conveyed. And the influx of some notable Shiite clerics who propagate a more activist approach where we're going to take our fate into our own hands was sort of simmering in Shiite society at the time. And you had several very famous clerics come from Iran and elsewhere, sort of really energized the Shiite population. Within the context of the civil war, for the first time the Shiites sort of pick up arms with the creation of the Amal militia, which was a predecessor, is a little simplistic, but it was the first Shiite militia in the civil war in 1976. And they still are around today. The Speaker of the Parliament in Lebanon is Nabi Berri, who's from the Amal party. So you have the Shiites taking up arms to fight Christians, Palestinians, everybody else. You have this sort of activist current, and then you have the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which is for the first time the Shia see the sort of the empowerment and it's like the culmination of all these energies, where there's now a Shiite state, activist, revolutionary. And so when the Israelis are, in a sense, ignorant or didn't internalize these dramatic undercurrents that are simmering in Shiite society. And in 1982, they go rumbling into Lebanon, into Beirut, and lo and behold, they become the focal point of massive militant energies. Though to say that the Shia were always against Israel, I actually found a very cool anecdote when I was doing, I interviewed Moshe Arens, who was the defense minister in the early 1980s in Israel, and he actually discusses, because keep in mind the Palestinians are the number one Israel's priority at the time. And they actually make an overture to the Amal militia in 1983, where he says, listen, to an Amal commander, Amal figure, he goes, we don't really care about you guys, you're not our problem. We'll fund you, we'll give you weapons, just keep the Palestinians away from the border, we don't have any problem with you. And the Amal militia, as this defense minister recounted, when these guys get older, they get very forthcoming. They're willing to spill the deets. He goes, it's not that we don't want to help you, I just can't help you. And he goes, the defense minister replies, if you don't help us, we're going to fight you and we're going to beat you. And he goes, you forget one thing, we the Shiites enjoy suffering. Sort of a very interesting, weird dynamic. It kind of illustrates the Israelis never really got the enemy that they were fighting. They didn't understand the fabric and the socio-religious motivations of Hezbollah. I just love that anecdote. So basically, Israel's plan falls apart almost immediately. Bashir Gemayel is assassinated. There's this very devastating siege of Beirut. There's the Sovereign Shatia massacre, which Israel is indirectly implicated in when Falange militiamen massacred Palestinians in 2 refugee camps. Things are going sour very fast. So they start a phased withdrawal back towards Israel. They're sort of cooperating at the time with a Maronite proxy militia called the South Lebanon Army, SLA. It had a different name before, but it's essentially the same core, mostly from Maronites, but there were other sects as well. They started this pullback in to Israel. And what's amazing is that the defense minister, Rabin at the time, says, we're getting out of Lebanon, we don't want to be there, no fourth winter in Lebanon, not at any price. This is in 1985. What they decide they're going to do in order to keep security on the northern border is establish a temporary security zone, which was to be policed primarily by the Southern Lebanon Army with the Israeli Army, as sort of a temporary measure to secure quiet in the north. Very sort of nebulous strategic goal. And what's the tragedy of this is that this final stage, Rabin gives an amazing interview in like February 1985 on television. This is our last stage, no fourth winter. And what it turns out, they end up being there on the ground for 18 years. And this is sort of like Israel's forgotten war. It's basically the Lebanon conflict from 1982 to 2000 is essentially like Israel's Vietnam War. It's a real societal trauma. Militarily, was never really given a priority. I mean, don't dive into the historical analogy too strongly, but soldiers who fought there were not necessarily, viewed the same way the soldiers fighting elsewhere. And it's also an amazing case study of the evolution of insurgency from the early 1980s to where Hezbollah became today. Just to provide context for why, we'll help explain what on earth Hezbollah is doing in Syria. Iran, post-1979, exporting the revolution, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGCs on the ground in Lebanon very, very early on, 82, 83. And you have amazing speeches at the time from Hezbollah leaders being like, the Iranian, when Khomeini speaks, everyone else needs to be silent, denying Iran's help to the Islamic resistance, the Lebanese resistance, which is Hezbollah, is like denying that the sun shines on the earth. I mean, it's interesting when you look at it now, Hezbollah makes a very, very concerted effort to sort of highlight its own autonomy ideologically and downplay its sort of like pro-Iranian identity. It's just sort of an interesting way that they have ideologically maneuvered. And of course, there's also Syrian assistance. Syria had been on the ground in Lebanon since 1976. They provided a lot. Initially, they were actually providing support to Amal, but eventually they too are supporting and financially, militarily providing stuff to Hezbollah. So at this time, Israel basically views Hezbollah on par with the Palestinian type threat, a low intensity, non-state. In Israeli security jargon, they coin it a routine security, compared to like fundamental security, which would be like conventional militaries. This stuff that can really do, is like the existential danger to the state. Keep in mind, this is, my math, 9 years after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So the focus from the Israeli military is still very much on that conventional military threat from Syria. You know, they had just fought these iconic tank battles in the Golan Heights in '73. They're not really thinking about how do we fight guerrilla warfare, counterterrorism. It's not the priority. The priority really is conventional warfare. And this is sort of allows the Lebanon conflict to fester. And this is this shift, eventual shift, when they realize that they have to adapt the way they fight, sort of the book tells the tale of how they eventually, shift. At this time, Hezbollah, big in there, some of their big terrorist attacks, the 82 Marine Corps barracks bombing, U.S. Embassy, Israeli military headquarters. This is basically the time period of Thomas Friedman's Beirut to Jerusalem, sort of like the rampant kidnappings, journalists, which they eventually, for a whole host of reasons, decide to move away from. But the Israeli army considers Hezbollah to be this routine-style threat. They don't really give the organizational attention that it deserves. And Nasrallah gives some amazing speeches where he goes, the Israeli army they don't really understand the nature of the threat they're facing yet. And he gives, it's just so ominous when you look at it, like a speech in 1991, 1992. Kind of amazing. So at the time, Hezbollah is sort of fighting very, very crude guerrilla tactics. They don't really know what they're doing yet. They have the influx from Iran, but they're sort of doing like the Iranian army did in the Iran-Iraq war, sort of charging across minefields and running up to running up hills to hilltop fortifications, like the things that even if you're not a military pro, it's not a good idea. Like, don't charge up a hill. This is the kind of stuff they were doing. And I remember when I interviewed an Israeli, now he's a general, but he was just a young soldier. He's like, these guys used to come running up. They didn't even know that we had night vision goggles. We used to just shoot them down. They had no idea where shots were coming from. Sort of like, but eventually they learn the hard way and they start to adapt. In 1989, the civil war finally comes to a halt and every militant group in Lebanon is supposed to lay down their arms. Hezbollah doesn't, which is still a point of contention to this day with the other sects. And they say, we're just going to keep them to fight Israel. And this is sort of what happens to this very day. Now, in 1989, the second Secretary General of Hezbollah sort of assumes command. His name is Abbas Musawi. Whenever Nasrallah speaks about Sayyid Abbas in his speeches, it's always, and he was only Secretary General for a year and a half before he was assassinated. But he had very, very close ties with the Iranians, and he had benefited a lot from this support militarily from the IRGC. And he leads sort of a concerted organizational effort for Hezbollah to militarily change the way they're doing things. He's like, no more frontal assaults. Everyone's very lots of disparate cells that are not taking orders in the right way, and very, very disorganized. And one thing that he also starts, and with this improvement, you see Israel's casualty rates slowly start to creep up. And in response to this, Israelis decide let's take out Abbas Musawi. The decision to actually do it was very ad hoc and very improvised. Interesting. Somebody within the Air Force at the time, who again was like reflecting back, was like, we didn't really consider the implications of what would happen if we assassinated Musawi. But we saw him get in his car, we saw the opportunity, we had all this new Air Force, expensive technology, optical find, fix, kill. We saw him driving from an Apache helicopter, we fired the shot. And what this elicits is, for the first time in a more systemic way, is Katyusha rockets. Now, Katyushas are not new to the Middle East. I remember when I went down, as I'm sure everybody here does, go down that research rabbit hole. When was the first usage of Katyusha in the Middle East? It's actually like in 1968 by a Palestinian militia from Lebanon. But in 1992, this is the first systematic use of the Katyusha, and they fire into the security zone and into Kiryat Shmona, Israeli towns in the north. And this is sort of the first time we see that reciprocal tit-for-tat equation where an Israeli strike elicits a counter-strike. And Nasrallah gives very candid speeches at the time, saying that the Katyusha is how we're marking our relationship, where no strike will go unanswered, and this kind of thing. And in response, the head of Northern Command in late 1992 sort of loosens Israel's targeting policies to hit Hezbollah militants, within the confines of Lebanese villages. And this tit-for-tat relationships is sort of the origins of the deterrence relationship which exists to this day between Israel and Hezbollah. It's that, where an Israeli strike elicits Hezbollah rocket fire, just like Hezbollah guerrilla attack elicits an Israeli strike. And this equation sort of, after a particularly damaging attack in July 1993, the Israelis decide that we need to send a message and a signal with much more force in order to strengthen our deterrence. Because in a sense, for students of deterrence, the whole conflict with Hezbollah from the 90s onwards is sort of it's like a deterrence game between both sides. And it's a 6-day operation, mostly from using the Air Force. Hezbollah elicits rocket fire, not that effectively, but enough to do some damage. The same thing happens again as part of this difference in 1996. And these two operations are sort of key learning points for Hezbollah, where they learn about the benefits of what the rocket fire does to Israeli society. It's obviously very important for 2006. They didn't have the Iron Dome back then. They had a bomb shelter system, but society, the general population goes into the shelters. So you have short-range rocket fire. They understood by 1996, based on lessons from 93, the importance of bunkers and improving their absorption and ability to survive airstrikes. And this is sort of a key lesson that we see in '06 as well. And the resilience of Lebanese population. When I actually interviewed the Hezbollah official, this was the big thing. He didn't really talk about anything substantive, but what he mentioned over and over again was how the resilience of the population base is something that is like a central pillar to Hezbollah's organizational strength. And this is sort of like the key. Now, but what Israel tried to do with these airstrikes was what in the military they called it was their lever policy, where they were using airstrikes to apply pressure on the Lebanese population, the Lebanese government, to apply pressure on Syria. At this time, Israel is negotiating with Syria over the Golan Heights. The Oslo Accords started in 1993. There's all the negotiations. Some of these professors at Georgetown were probably the diplomatic envoys. There's like from the State Department, Aaron David Miller, Dennis Ross. This was like the heyday for them. And so Syria and Israel are negotiating over the Golan, and Syria is able to use Hezbollah as basically a proxy, as its own lever against Israel. Now, Israeli defense officials will say that we operated with one hand behind our back in the 90s because we didn't want to jeopardize the ongoing negotiations. We sort of always have to fight Hezbollah with one hand behind our back. Of course, this policy of applying a lever on the Lebanese population through airstrikes and the Lebanese government, which Hezbollah was part of from 92 onwards, to apply pressure on Syria, is sort of doomed to fail from the start, because we know, certainly today, that the Assad regime doesn't care if the Lebanese population is suffering, just like it doesn't care if anybody's suffering. But so this lever policy was sort of doomed to fail. They come to a first tacit and then explicit agreement, or set of understandings which define the rules of the game, which sort of allow each side, it basically outlines that each side should not target civilians, but that each side has the right to self-defense. But this was sort of doomed to fail because Hezbollah is like a guerrilla group enmeshed amongst the civilian population. So an airstrike against a Hezbollah target, which within a civilian, amongst the civilian population, immediately elicits a Hezbollah reaction. And also, it never provided any guarantees for Israeli troops based in Lebanon. You're not in a very good negotiating position if you are occupying part of southern Lebanon, because they were sort of sitting ducks at the time. But this was important for how it sort of illustrated that both sides do signal and talk to each other. In 1996, there's actually, if you want to talk about conflict management, there's actually, in the aftermath of the 96 agreement, it's called the Israel-Lebanon Monitoring Group, and it's actually Israel, Lebanon, and Syria were meeting together in the Lebanese town of Nakura with the UN in order to manage large-scale outbreaks of the conflict. And actually, from the time it met in 96 to 2000, you had all sides meeting with the UN in this Lebanese town, and it did prevent any large-scale, 93, 96 style airstrikes. But it never really prevented the day-to-day grind, which eventually like in any long guerrilla conflict, wears down the military. Now, in the mid-90s, you basically have the IDF come to the realization that this counterterrorism or this routine security approach for how they're dealing with Hezbollah, on par with how they dealt with the Palestinians, it's not working anymore. And you basically have, again, not a very apt analogy, but not bad, you have the Israeli version of General Petraeus being like, we need to go towards counter-guerrilla warfare, because counterterrorism and this routine security is not working for us anymore. Hezbollah is not like the Palestinians, they have more, and in the 1990s, he's particularly well placed to sort of make these changes. Just to sort of highlight one example of like the organizational processes at work, you have that very open, dynamic military culture, very like flexible, informal. Every military officer his shirt is unbuttoned 3/4 down, with chest hair. Everyone is calling each other by their nickname. But this, in a sense, allowed soldiers on the bottom to confront their superiors with sort of their challenges, and the ability to voice concerns as a junior soldier, junior officer, is sort of like a prized and valued attribute within the Israeli military. But this leads to a process where the head of Northern Command, which is the Lebanon arena, was like, we have a problem here. And he's also, this same general, very connected to the top because they all fought together back in the day. Everybody knows everyone. And he basically develops a unit, it's called the EGOS, but it's a counter-guerrilla warfare unit designed basically to devise solutions for how to deal with Hezbollah. Sort of a very Israeli army way of doing things. They create a new unit to solve a very specific problem with the hopes that this unit will basically figure it out, improvise, do whatever they need to do to make it work, and then they'll teach everybody else how to do it. And you see this to this day. You see this with how they deal with the tunnels in Gaza. You've seen this since the very beginning. It's always, there's like a specialized commando unit, which means that we have like, there's, counter tunnel units, checkpoint units, desert recon, everything is very hyper specialized. But this is sort of interesting for how an army learns and adapts. But in any event, this slowly does shift the focus towards counter-guerrilla warfare, and you do see this unit develop all sorts of innovative tactics for surveillance and stealth and bush warfare, because the Lebanese terrain is very hilly and foresty. And the word actually means walnut, translated from Hebrew, but you see at the time lots of funny speeches by Hezbollah leaders being like, this walnut unit doesn't scare us, Hezbollah is going to crack the walnuts of the IDF. So just funny to see this back and forth between both sides. And we heard, there's one speech, like we heard the head of the walnut unit say that Hezbollah needs to be on the run and that they're going to try and regain the initiative. Like, we have the Israelis walnuts and we're going to crack them and we have the initiative, just stuff like that. Always interesting to see. But because of this sort of damaging, the 93-96 operations don't stop the day-to-day grind. And even though this unit is making very, very innovative gains in the counter-guerrilla domain, where we've sort of shifted from CT to some sort of counter-guerrilla coin kind of thing, though without the hearts and minds, basically. Society was always very discontent with this conflict, with Israel's presence in Lebanon. It was basically what was considered Israel's first war of choice, opposed to a war of no choice, like the existential wars of 67 and 73, etc. And you see massive protests in Israel, 10% of the population in the central squares, which is a lot of people protesting against. There were some high-profile blunders and accidents. But you see Hezbollah militarily has also adapted, and in response to some of this, the EGOS unit's gains, Hezbollah sort of starts to do more indirect operations, more of this hit-and-run stuff, more anti-tank weapons, which were very big in 06, more rocket fire. So even though the Israeli army became very adept at, the face-to-face counter-guerrilla stuff, they can never really deal with these sort of indirect operations by Hezbollah, and this really led to an erosion. So eventually, Ehud Barak is elected prime minister, and he basically pulls Israel out of Lebanon, and very hastily in one day, very chaotic. But the implications of this period are that Hezbollah clearly is a versatile learning organization. It highlights this patron-client relationship between Hezbollah and Syria, which we're seeing yet again today, where Syria was using Hezbollah as a pawn in its negotiations over the Golan, and they did up until the end. I mean, when Barak pulled out, he thought that this would now allow Israel to negotiate with greater freedom against Syria, but it never really worked out that way. We see the rules of the game and the establishment of this deterrence relationship between Israel and Hezbollah, which has evolved and manifests itself today. And of course, the failure of this lever policy of the IDF's ability to, put a lever on the Lebanese population or government to restrain Hezbollah. So post-2000, Israel says that we're going to strike back against Hezbollah, any infraction. Now that we're out of Lebanon, this is where, we're in good shape. Hezbollah does an amazing ideological adaptation where for years we exist to get Israel out of Lebanon. Israel gets out of Lebanon. What's the new cause? Called the Sheba Farms. It's a very Middle Eastern issue. It's like a ridiculous 8 square mile territory on the slopes of the Golan on the border of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Israel says that it's part of Syria, but annexes it as they did with the Golan. Syria says it's Lebanese. Lebanon says it's Lebanese. The UN says it's Syrian. So there's everyone, no one knows who it really belongs to. Israel says we'll deal with the Sheba when we deal with Syria with a negotiation, but Lebanon's like it's ours. So this tiny little farmland, rocky area is the new point of friction. At the same time, the second Intifada kicks off, and Israel is now faced with this wave of Palestinian militancy, suicide bombings, and the works, and this sort of distracts the Israeli army from what it's doing. And they invest heavily in counterterrorism, Intifada-style fighting, and this is with checkpoints and raids and heavy counterterrorism. Why this is important is because it sort of keeps the IDF focused on counterterrorism at the expense of its historical strength, which was conventional military capabilities. So the rules of the game are adjusted in the Sheva, where Israel essentially tacitly accepts Hezbollah operations in this area. They don't really respond. They have their hands full with the Palestinian militant groups. And they try, in a sense, through some limited artillery, and even at one point strike Syrian targets in Lebanon as a way to try and deter Hezbollah from operating the Sheva. It doesn't work. But Hezbollah's provocations are confined to this area. So one morning in 2006, there's another Hezbollah. You could argue it's a miscalculation, and we could talk about it. They launch an incursion, just like they did the year prior, to kidnap soldiers in an area that was not the Sheva farms. And this essentially lights the 2006 war. Now, I won't get into the nuts. How much time do we have? The nuts and bolts of the war itself. I forgot to put it on. Oh no, I did. But my blood, sweat, and tears went into succinctly summarizing the main influences on the Israeli army in 2006. So number one would be the Intifada-style fighting. You spend 6 years or more focusing on counterterrorism. This eroded their capabilities for sort of more high-intensity conflict or more conventional warfare. Society also was always sick and tired of engaging in the Lebanese mud, as it was called in Israel. They don't want to get back and get stuck in Lebanon like they were for the 18 years prior. And of course, at the time, in the book devotes a lot of attention to this, how Israel was influenced by some very innovative military concepts that affected the way they fought in 2006, related to the use of air power, related to the use of effects, which was actually coined here in the U.S., effects-based operations. And there's a lot of, in the academic, it was very convoluted over how these things actually influenced the way that Israel fought in 2006. But I tried to break it down, and it was extremely challenging because you had all sorts of influences come from the U.S. and from elsewhere in a very piecemeal fashion. But the book explores that much more. But what was Hezbollah doing once this war kicks off? They had basically, in the 6 years that Israel was no longer in Lebanon, scattered rocket launching sites throughout southern Lebanon, basically prepared the battle space, enmeshed amongst the civilian fabric of southern Lebanon, built all sorts of fortifications, not quite tunnels like we saw from Gaza, but not far off. They called them, the Israeli military would call them nature reserves, but like these hidden, bushy, with trees hiding entrances where they would set up rockets. And the military released a lot of photographic evidence, and Hezbollah does too by now. They take Al-Safir and Al-Akhbar on these cool, interesting tours of their fortifications nowadays. But they realized basically a lesson from 93, 96 was low signature operations and old school attrition, hit and run. But they also have, largely due to the Iranian assistance, this sort of like mobile strike force, an offensive capability, which isn't really how low intensity guerrilla units fight, where it's not just that they were these offensive ambushes in conjunction with sort of defensive fortifications, which is again not how guerrillas strike and slip away. These were they were hold down the fort, so to speak. And this sort of hybrid really was a shock to the IDF, was a shock to the whole defense community. See, how did this militant group that started, the same group that blew up the Marine Corps barracks in 1982, is essentially using conventional military tactics and has the technology of Iranian Syrian military. They use drones and surface-to-ship missiles and advanced Cornet anti-tank missiles, which did a lot of damage. But they basically learned that the importance of absorbing strikes. So the Israelis, with all their fancy technology and supreme air supremacy, Hezbollah is able to absorb Israeli airstrikes. And the Hezbollah envoy, the Hezbollah rep, was like this: the resilience and our ability to absorb was our number one strength. That, every Hezbollah fighter is part of the village that he's from. So it was very much like a fish in the sea kind of thing. Which is it's important to consider the sort of the messy, terrain before you decide to get involved. But all these things are designed not necessarily to win in the conventional sense, but basically to survive. So when Israel is approaching this war with, half its conventional military capabilities worn down by fighting the Palestinians in Intifada, and an extreme hesitancy to use ground troops because of a reluctance to get back involved in Lebanon, it's sort of like the perfect storm. The Israeli chief of staff is given two options: either like a prolonged campaign, mobilize reserves, ground troops, or let's try and do it with the Air Force to start. Basically opts for the latter until the 31st day of the war. The war was 34 days. There was a very reluctant use of ground troops, and when they were used, because of all these training cuts in years gone by, because of lots of the military ideas and how it affected the Israeli budget and stuff like that in the years, they weren't ready for what they faced. And Hezbollah did not fight like the Palestinians, and they didn't really fight like the Syrian military in the Golan Heights. Instead, they fell somewhere in the middle, and the Israeli military was not sort of ready for that type of fighting. And also, I should mention, the Israeli Prime Minister on the 5th day of war decides to lay out Israel's goals, which that's probably a good indication you don't really know why you're fighting in the first place if you wait till the 5th day. And it was, to get the soldiers who have been kidnapped back, and that they're going to get the UN to get Hezbollah to lay down their weapons. All things that are basically, even if you beat them militarily, you're not necessarily going to achieve. Sort of set themselves up for failure. But the Air Force worked great. They sort of hit all the fancy technology that they have, hundreds of targets in the first day or two of the war. It's like they've reached their culmination of victory on the second day of the war. But despite the opinions of some of the generals, it sort of grinds on. The rocket fire doesn't stop. The book devotes quite a bit of attention to this. Some innovative ideas related to carrying out raids. It's an ability to psychologically affect Hezbollah. All sorts of, a lot of influence from the U.S. military and shock and awe, and they called it consciousness operations. And I won't bog you down with that now because I want to keep it more broad. But the ground operation is sort of lackluster. It's launched on the 31st day. The ceasefire is called on the 34th day. The key problem was the low intensity. The Palestinians fought somewhere between low intensity and conventional, and the Israelis weren't able to deal with it. So the question is, did Hezbollah miscalculate? And was Hezbollah so good, or was the Israeli army so bad? And I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, that Hezbollah devised a perfect operational paradigm to circumvent the technological strengths of the Israeli military. And in Israel, in the immediate aftermath of the war, there's typical self-flagellation for how poorly they did, and a massive inquiry of committee. The Winograd Commission was 618 pages long. In Hebrew, I don't recommend reading it, but you can if you want to. But all of a sudden, now it's 12 years of quiet, and we're like, wait, was this war a success? Was it not a success? And it's something that we could talk about. And we're like, all right, great, we finally have some quiet. Hezbollah seems to have learned that even though they fought Israel very well on the ground, the massive airstrikes deterred them. Israel struck quite devastatingly parts of Lebanon. Anything Lebanese government infrastructure that could be linked to Hezbollah, because Hezbollah was part of the Lebanese government at the time. So they sort of use that. And the more Hezbollah becomes entrenched in the Lebanese government, the greater the IDF's ability to say that we want to target X, Y, and Z Lebanese government infrastructure. So in a sense, the more they become entrenched in the Lebanese government and society, the greater ability Israel has to deter Hezbollah, because they have all these targets to hit. So we have quiet. We're like, great, we have, Israel says, if you strike back, we're going to do exactly what we did in the Dahia and Hezbollah's area of support in 2006. This sort of doctrine comes where there's some articles on it, disproportionate use of, they're going to exceed Hezbollah's expectations for how hard they're going to hit them. Quiet. Great. No, Syria. We thought maybe we would have some stability with this mutual deterrence, but Syria kicks off and complicates everything. So we know the story in 2011, Arab Spring, moderate rebels, not moderate rebels, everyone starts fighting Assad. In 2012, Hezbollah starts operating in Syria. Now, why? Because of the long-standing relationship between Syria and Hezbollah. Syria, for the most part of the 90s, was, and afterwards, was Hezbollah's patron. And Nasrallah gives a really funny speech. He goes, only an idiot wouldn't go to the aid of someone who cherished the resistance for so many years, implying like this is why Hezbollah is currently in Syria. And he's like, only a dumb person wouldn't come to someone who supported us for so long, we wouldn't go back them up. So no such thing as a free lunch, except for maybe right here. They're called back into Syria. This sort of explains why they're there. But they're also forced to ideologically adapt. They're historically, Hezbollah says we're only fighting Israel, but now they're fighting Sunnis in Syria. And watching Nasrallah and the group sort of, tiptoe around this issue and, change their rhetoric and their speeches to sort of spin it that the Takfiris and ISIS are Zionist extensions and all this kind of rhetorical tango. But other than basically protecting, Syria and the ability to potentially, keep its arms shipments coming in from Syria, Hezbollah, of all the groups fighting and all the sides, including the Turks and the Kurds and the GCC and everybody else, in a sense has the least to gain from being there. It's sort of like an interesting point. They don't really have any, other than keeping Syria friendly to them with Assad, they don't really have anything to gain. Now, the cons from fighting, well, you could say what are the cons from fighting there is that they're losing hundreds of fighters, probably by now up to 1,900 or so. I think by 2014 it was 400, by now it's about 1,900, 2,000. And if you follow some of Hezbollah's media outlets and stuff, there's always funerals, including senior guys like big names like Badruddin and all these different guys who have been killed along the way, as well as young babyface guys that they've essentially lowered the age of recruitment because they need the guys to send over there. Other sects in Lebanon are like, you said you were supposed to fight Israel, now what are you doing there? Especially some of the the Lebanese forces and other parties saying this is one guy even said this is Lebanon, this is going to be Hezbollah's Vietnam. It's kind of like an interesting. So they have to gamble, or rather juggle, the domestic Lebanese squabbling, which is always a headache for everybody. There's also a bit of Sunni jihadist blowback against Hezbollah, not so much anymore, but in 2013, 14, 15, there were some big bombings in Baalbek and Beirut. And Nasrallah is increasingly defensive of Hezbollah's, he's increasingly defensive, and they portray Syria as an existential threat. He said that a number of times on a number of occasions. But what's the pro? The pro is enter Russia in 2013. You want to talk about how a militant group who started in its humble beginnings, charging up hilltops, is now essentially carrying out joint or combined arms operations with the Russian military or Russian special forces on the ground. And they're learning, using armored warfare, combined arms, all the fancy Russian technology, which they probably always want to get their hands on, is now floating around in Syria. Russian intelligence, they're even, liaising with Russian air support and stuff like that. And they've learned a lot, and Hezbollah is quite candid as a way to deter Israel. They're like, we've learned a lot in Syria from Russia, so you better watch out. The one figure, an MP for Hezbollah, was like, we know the Israeli army is losing countless nights of sleep based on our, what they're trying to figure out what we've learned with the Russians in Syria and stuff like that. But what's Israel? How does Israel fit into this? Israel does not want to get involved in the Syrian conflict because it's a mess. But as an extension of the rules of the game, which were adapted since 1992, when first it became tacit acceptance of, hitting the IDF and Lebanon, and then it became Sheba Farms, Israel has first two, and then it became three. Number one, no game-changing weaponry, no chemical weapons, no surface-to-air missiles. stuff like that. And they'll use, and they have illustrated quite evidently, its Air Force and Special Forces to prevent game-changing weaponry going to Hezbollah from Syria. For the first time in 2017, the head of the Air Force in Israel admitted 100 airstrikes that they've carried out, give or take, since the start of the Syrian conflict, probably up to 200 by now. And for the first time, they actually had to admit it publicly when the Syrians downed this Russian transport plane. After the Israelis carried a strike, they had to say, sorry, it was us, we were there, but we're not the ones who blew up the Russian transport plane. That was the Syrians who basically closed their eyes and fired a surface-to-air missile. But it's out in the open that Israel's willing to utilize deterrence by punishment and these kinds of air operations to prevent these kinds of game-changing weapons. Number two is to prevent Hezbollah encroaching in the Golan Heights, the Syrian side of the Golan. And I guess the third, which is new, is to prevent the Iranians anywhere in southern Syria. And this recent flow of airstrikes against Iranian targets sort of highlights that. And now the Israel-Hezbollah conflict and all the history that goes along with it, and the Syrian conflict and the mess that goes along with that, there's a confluence in basically January 2015, where Hezbollah and elements of the IRGC want to try and set up shop on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. It results in an airstrike against the Hezbollah Iranian convoy, kills Iranian generals and Hezbollah fighters. And this is sort of like this was when they laid it down first, that this infraction of the rules of the game is not going to be tolerated. And in truth, the Syrian army is sort of staying out of it. But neither side wants an escalation. You see the rhetoric between both sides. Each side is sort of tiptoeing around what they're trying to do without pushing the other side over the brink. And if you want to, for students of deterrence between a conventional state and a non-state group, it's an amazing sort of dynamic that's evolved. I really think, in truth, I mean, obviously, I think this conflict is super interesting and cool. You could basically find any element of security studies that you want to study, you could find manifest itself in this conflict. It's sort of like the Peloponnesian War. You can find anything you want to work on in this conflict. So Israel wants to keep it quiet, no game-changing weapons, but Hezbollah is still there, and you have even Nasrallah proclaim, a second liberation. The first liberation being getting the Israelis out of Lebanon 2000. His second liberation is against ISIS and the Sunni groups. And he says that we're at a semi-final victory. Don't ask me what that actually means, but they're portraying themselves and they're staying put, no sign of leaving. Iran is still using Hezbollah and other militia groups in Syria as a lever against Israel. And Assad, who's essentially got his country back for the most part, has essentially kept himself out of this tango between Israel and Hezbollah. Now, of course, you could ask, what's the future of war going to look like? I guess I could probably say that for the questions and anything else. I think what I've hopefully illustrated is sort of the origins of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict, how we got to where we are today, how Hezbollah sort of evolved and developed from, how they got their fighting experience, how they developed from a ragtag militia, to starting to use rockets, to enhancing their guerrilla warfare capabilities, to getting almost this conventional kind of capability in 2006, to ending up in Syria. The origins of the mutual deterrence relationship that started in 92 and evolved through 93, 96, into the post-2000 period to where we are today within the confines of Syria. And also what both sides are doing there. Of course, in the book, I talk a lot more about some of the specific military doctrinal concepts that were used by Israel over the years, and if that's your thing, then you should read the second part of the book. But with that, I hope I've convinced you that it's an important conflict and an interesting one with a very rich historical narrative that's worth looking at, that helps us understand what's happened and what's happening and what will happen. So I guess with that, hopefully everyone's head is still on straight. I don't know if mine is, but I'm happy for any questions or comments or anything along the way. Thanks a lot.
I'm curious, like, looking at the future as the Syrian conflict kind of winds down, and whether or not you think Hezbollah forces will actually leave Syria, if they'll stay, and then when they do get back, the growing influence that Hezbollah has in the actual Lebanese government, what kind of impact that's going to have on relations between Israel and Lebanon.
So everybody thinks that once Assad gets his country back fully, that Hezbollah will leave. Hezbollah openly has said, we're not going anywhere until Assad says it's time for us to go. There hasn't really been any indication that they're going to leave. They're hunkering down quite nicely in the south and all these different areas. And they haven't given really an indication that they're going to go. What was the second part?
The growing influence that Hezbollah has, like, legitimately within the Lebanese government, like taking over positions.
Right.
And
So one thing I didn't really mention, only briefly, was the Hezbollah's political component, which is half its identity, or a quarter of its identity. Involvement in Lebanese politics in 92, they're in elections in 92, 96, 98. They entered the Lebanese cabinet in the mid-2000s, and in 2008 they essentially have a veto over the Lebanese cabinet. And now they hold ministries, they hold the agricultural ministry and telecommunications, and I think this entrenchment in the Lebanese government is only going to continue. Right now I know they're grappling over control of the health ministry. I mean, the telecoms industry helps them because they basically are allowed to have their own like secret network that everyone else in Lebanon has to deal with, like failing electricity and failing internet. They have their own, fiber optic thing. The health ministry is essentially part of their social services component. And I think you're only going to see further entrenchment in the Lebanese government. But like I mentioned, the ramifications of that are that Israel's like, you control like the power grid, then the power grid is fair game in a future war. And this is a huge deterrent because your average Lebanese person, even though when the lights go out, I mean, it's pretty common in Lebanon, there are grumblings that like Hezbollah, who is the defender of Lebanon, is putting the whole country at risk. And this is the constant debate within Israel, within Lebanon, about is this an effective deterrent? For now, it seems to be holding. But we also know that the Lebanese population is not necessarily an effective lever to use against Hezbollah because of the way that they view things. Yeah? No?
So this kind of plays off that, but in those like decade after '06, was that Hezbollah able to like functionally exist without having an active conflict, or does it just double down on the political front? Or how did they like persist?
Post '06, you said?
Yeah, right, when they had like some years of relative less action.
Well, I think that ideologically, even though Israel's no longer in Lebanon post-2000, they still use the Sheba farms as their focal point, and that's still a point of contention between two sides. That becomes, the focal point for ideologically for them, for why they need to defend. And they become, rather than fighting, Israel as an occupying force in Lebanon, the way that they also frame it, this is, what an amazing, Nasrallah has one speech, he goes, what an amazing place for us to be in. Before, we were a guerrilla group getting an occupying enemy out of our country, but now we're the defenders of Lebanon. We're like the deterrent effect of keeping them out. So they've sort of framed it in that way, where they exist as a deterrent for Israel's belligerence against Lebanon, as they frame it. So, and deterrence features very prominently in their in the rhetoric of the leadership, and you really see this amazing sort of deterrence tango, mostly through signaling, some through the UN, but mostly just between leaders yelling at each other through third party or the media.
In the Hezbollah Regional Manifesto, but also in the 2007 revisited version, Hezbollah explicitly calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, and they pretty explicitly say that the ultimate goal of the part of God is to push Israelis to the sea. Let's go that way. And also there is a pretty interesting video that Hezbollah put out on their website planning like the tactical invasion of Israel from the north, and how would that play out from the Golan Heights and the invasion of Beersheba and the destruction of Tel Aviv and all sorts of funny things. So how would you assess that component of Hezbollah's ideology vis-a-vis their more limited stated aims of just defending Lebanon from Can you show your explanation?
I mean, how you're sort of describing like how Hezbollah has attempted to ideologically adapt itself while staying core to its true tenets. The 1985 open letter, when their 5 goals are destruction of Israel, get the make Lebanon an Islamic state, get the U.S. and France out of Lebanon, and I forgot what the last part is, but they've been forced over the years, as you point out, to ideologically adapt and sort of tone down, even though they probably do want an Islamic state in Lebanon. They're basically willing to put that on the sidelines, and their leadership has attempted to sort of focus elsewhere. The destruction of Israel is their, their deep-seated desire, but they know that it's not achievable, and so they've sort of tempered their own expectations to say that we're going to deter. We'll be content to deter the group. I mean, and it's obviously for domestic. What's the word?
Yeah.
Domestic audience mostly. The one thing you highlight about their desire to invade the north of Israel. So the first time Nasrallah discusses this, 2011, he says that we're gonna invade the Galilee. We've spent the last 5 years preparing ourselves. Since 2006, Israel's scared of us, and rather than sit and wait for the Israelis to come and invade us again, in a future war, we're gonna cross in. And they released like an amazingly, for psychological warfare and people who are into that kind of thing, it's pretty interesting, where it's like an infographic of soldiers crossing the fence and coming in. And he's gone back to this many times in his speeches, discussing how the Israelis don't know about the surprises of the Hezbollah commandos who are going to come into the Galilee, and they'll release footage of like Israeli farming communities on the border, all sorts of psychological tools to. And I think in a future war, Israeli military intelligence estimates, I think, stay with pretty good confidence that they think that will happen, because. So historically, Hezbollah thought that a long, drawn-out war would benefit them. This long, attritional guerrilla conflict, and Israel always thought, a rapid war with the air power that's historically how they always did things. Keep it 6 days or less kind of thing. But the more this gone on, Hezbollah realizes that with Israel's increased military technology and Israeli society's increased staying power because of the Iron Dome system, which is missile defense system, and the increased bomb shelters and stuff like that Israel's staying power is pretty formidable. So they think it's almost like each side has tried to mirror the historical strategies of the other. Hezbollah wants to try and shorten a future war with like a sharp, decisive, psychologically damaging blow within the first days of war. So even if all these Hezbollah commandos who enter into Israel are killed, which they would be pretty soon, if they have one video of a Hezbollah guy waving a flag in an Israeli town, the psychological impact will reverberate extremely deeply, and Israel won't be able to recover from that. And the top generals, when I spoke to them and in open source stuff, they're very aware of that this will be a psychological shock to Israeli society, that the sense of security will really be shaken. And so Hezbollah will try and get the war over as fast as possible, fire as many rockets as they can in a very short amount of time, because they know if they don't fire quickly, we'll probably get hit because of the IDF sensor, the shooter technology, and intel of the whole arena. And Israel says, we have the Iron Dome system. Yes, it's expensive, but we have Western backing. We have bomb shelters. Our civilians know how to deal with these kinds of things. We can outlast you, and our Air Force will just decimate your areas of support. So who's going to outlast who? So you sort of have like a really amazing mirroring of one another, like the wrestling match illusion. Each one is sort of playing. Historically, each one played to each other's. Well, I think they always play to each other's strengths, and Hezbollah tried to circumvent Israel's strengths, but now you sort of have the whole thing going on from the other vantage point. Please.
Does Israel care about, or has it tried to push back on a lot of Hezbollah's other funding sources besides Iran, like its drug trafficking and money laundering?
So if you wanted to look at Hezbollah as a four-pronged actor, where they have a militant or military capability, they have sort of a terrorist component, they have a sort of criminal component, and they have a governing or political, and I guess they also have a social services component, so five-pronged. I think you have some of the Obama administration started it, the Trump administration has really driven it through. along with Western allies, to clamp down on Hezbollah's criminal funding sources. It sort of touches on this at the very end of the book, just for how increased sanctions against the group and against Iran affect Hezbollah's ability to adapt militarily. There's no doubt the increased scrutiny from the West on, number one, what Hezbollah is doing in Syria, sort of what got them on the EU blacklist. Yes, there was the attack in Bulgaria, which the EU was like, because they only designated one component of the group. They designated them, and the sort of war crimes that Hezbollah is committing in Syria sort of got them that black stripe against them, also from the GCC. So these kinds of things have all contributed to dampening its ability to innovate. And I know the Hezbollah International Financing Act was in 2015 by Obama, now doubled down in 2017, 2018. In this administration, there's no doubt that it does dampen their ability. So there's a whole debate. This is not really in the book about to what degree is this drug trafficking and criminal component play into the group's fundraising. It's a fascinating discussion. It's not mentioned in the book because it's not quite on a military level, but I guess it depends what U.S. law enforcement agency you ask. If you ask the DEA, they'd probably say yes, and other agencies give more. I think the criminality does play into the terrorism stuff and terrorist financing, but it's very nuanced. But efforts to sort of dampen that do affect its military component. I mean, there was guys in where was it, Minnesota, trying to export dual-use technology for the group, night vision goggles. You have stuff like that percolates to the surface. So in that regard, it would help. But it's sort of like a long discussion, which I'm really into, but I don't know if anybody else is. Please.
So you didn't really mention Iran that much. So I'm just, and obviously like Iran is a big topic in the news today and a big focus of this administration. But more specific to the topic, your topic in the book, did you see evidence of IRGC, Quds Force sort of influencing Hezbollah's decision making with their military innovation and adaptation, or was it more of an indigenous, like self-contained, or is that more of a back and forth all the time relationship?
I think nowadays it's there's sort of like an undercurrent where Hezbollah tries to distance itself from the degree of support that it gets from Iran, militarily, financially, and the works. But I think it was very clear early on from Hezbollah leaders' statements that Iran was very involved in getting Hezbollah up to where it was, especially in the first decade. Exploring the revolution is like the big thing, post 79, and there were IRGC guys on the ground, and of course Hezbollah, when you interview them, are not going to be like, yeah, the Iranians helped us do XYZ, but the Israeli military intel guys, if you give them enough coffee, they eventually will be like, yeah, the IRGC used to be on the ground there, and we used to see them give their courses in the Baalbek, and like the influence of Iran on Musawi was particularly pronounced. Nasrallah wasn't really a military guy. Musawi was a little bit more, but the influence of Iran is pervasive, and this sort of explains why Hezbollah is in Syria to an extent to this day. And then this leads to a whole nother discussion of how does Iranian decision-making influence Hezbollah's decision-making, and who actually calls the shots for a future war. I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that question. I think Iran exerts a degree of influence, not on the micro level, but probably on the macro level. The day-to-day operates during a war. It's definitely day-to-day. Hezbollah has pretty seasoned militant commanders who know what they're doing. They operate with mission command and autonomously, just like any other smart guerrilla organization. But there's Iranian military advisors floating around. There still are, and probably always will be. Anybody else?
All right, well, Raphael, thank you very much for coming today and
Thanks for having
spending
me.
your lunch with us.